When I calmly pulled out a chair and sat down right next to my billionaire husband's pregnant mistress, I expected him to be shocked. What I did not expect was the look of pure, unadulterated panic that washed over his face, a terror so deep it made him drop his crystal champagne glass, shattering it across the marble floor. In that single echoing moment, the carefully buried secrets of his supposed empire began to unravel, and the truth he had spent years hiding was finally about to destroy everything. My name is Nia. I am 35 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been the silent architect behind the man everyone in Atlanta calls a self-made real estate tech billionaire. Before I continue this story and reveal exactly how I dismantled his entire life in a single evening, take a moment to drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. And if you have ever had a partner or a family member underestimate your intelligence while building their success on your back, hit that like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear every single detail of how I took back my crown. The Atlanta Black Excellence Charity Gala is the kind of event where people measure your worth by the designer label on your back and the number of commas in your bank account. It is the pinnacle of the city's elite social season. The grand ballroom of the Buckhead Plaza Hotel was draped in gold and emerald velvet. Chandeliers the size of small cars cast a warm, expensive glow over the room. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided silently between tables, balancing silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. It was a room full of politicians, celebrities, and business moguls, all gathered to celebrate the wealth and success of our community. And right at the center of it all, sitting at the premier VIP table, was my husband, Xavier. Xavier was wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo that I paid for. He was flashing his perfect veneer smile at the cameras, soaking in the admiration of the room. He looked every bit the visionary CEO he claimed to be. But the illusion was shattered for me the moment I saw who was sitting to his right. It was Gia. Gia was a 25-year-old Instagram influencer who played the role of an innocent high society darling. Tonight, she was wearing a clinging silver silk gown that deliberately accentuated the slight curve of her stomach. She had her hand resting gently on Xavier's arm, laughing at a joke he had just told. Surrounding them were Xavier's family, including his sister Tasha, who was beaming at Gia as if they were already lifelong sisters. They all thought I was out of town at a financial conference in Chicago. They thought they had the entire night to parade this girl around, testing the waters for the day Xavier finally decided to replace me. They were wrong. I did not storm into the room. I did not yell, cry, or cause a scene. I walked in with the perfect posture my grandmother taught me, wearing a stunning black Carolina Herrera gown that fit me like a second skin. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor as I crossed the massive ballroom. I could feel the eyes of the other guests turning toward me, the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd as people recognized the wife of the man of the hour. I kept my face completely neutral, an icy mask of composure. When I reached the VIP table, the conversation died instantly. Tasha's mouth fell open, her fork suspended halfway to her lips. Gia's fake bubbly laugh caught in her throat. Xavier froze, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. There was an empty chair directly between Xavier and Gia. Without missing a beat, I placed my clutch on the table, pulled the chair back, and sat down right next to the woman who was sleeping with my husband. I smiled pleasantly at the table. "Good evening, family," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." That was when the glass slipped from Xavier's hand. It hit the edge of the table and crashed onto the floor, sending shards of crystal and expensive champagne flying across the polished marble. He did not even flinch at the sound. He just stared at me, his chest heaving, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or worse, an executioner. Tasha was the first to recover. Tasha is 37 years old, a woman who has spent her entire adult life treating her brother's bank account like her personal ATM. She fancies herself the golden child of the family, a woman of high class, though she has not worked a real job in her life. She leaned across the table, her face twisted into a vicious sneer. "What are you doing here?" "Nia." Tasha hissed, her voice a loud, abrasive whisper meant to intimidate me. You need to leave, right now. You are embarrassing Xavier, and you are ruining this night for the rest of us. Look around, you do not belong here tonight. I slowly turned my head to look at my sister-in-law. I did not blink. I just let her words hang in the air, allowing the silence to make her uncomfortable. But Tasha was never one to know when to stop talking. Do not look at me like that! Tasha continued, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and malicious glee. We all know the truth. You are just a glorified accountant. Xavier is building a legacy, and Gia here is carrying his real heir. So do yourself a favor, pack your little bags, and go back to whatever boring corporate office you crawled out of. This table is for the future of this family. The sheer audacity of her words would have broken me a year ago. A year ago, I would have fled this room in tears, wondering why my love and my sacrifices were never enough for this family. I would have agonized over the fact that I was the one who funded her luxury cars, her designer bags, and her supposed high society lifestyle, only to be cast aside the moment a younger, more compliant woman came along. But I was no longer the woman who sought their approval. I was the woman who controlled their survival. I did not raise my voice. I did not acknowledge Tasha's pathetic attempt to humiliate me. Instead, I raised my hand slightly to catch the attention of a passing waiter. He hurried over immediately, sensing the tension at the table. I will have a gin and tonic, please, I told the waiter with a polite smile. Hendrix, if you have it. And please, bring a glass of sparkling water for Miss Reynolds here. We certainly would not want her to dehydrate in this heavy gown. The color completely drained from Gia's face. She visibly shrank back in her chair, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table. Miss Reynolds, I said, turning to look Gia directly in the eyes. That is your legal name, is it not? Gia Reynolds, originally from Macon, Georgia. Although I suppose the name on the shell company documents we will be discussing later is slightly different. A strange, strangled noise escaped Xavier's throat. He reached up and yanked at the collar of his tuxedo as if it were suddenly choking him. Nia, he gasped, his voice cracking. Nia, please, let us just go outside. Let us go to the car. Please, I am begging you. Tasha looked back and forth between her brother and me, completely confused by his reaction. Xavier, what is wrong with you? She snapped. Why are you begging her? Tell security to escort her out. She is insulting your pregnant girlfriend. But Xavier could not even look at Tasha. His eyes were locked on mine, filled with a primal, desperate fear. He knew. In that exact moment, he knew that I had not come to this gala to fight over a man. I had not come to cry over a broken marriage or beg him to choose me over his mistress. I had come to dismantle the empire I built for him. Xavier was not afraid of a cheating scandal. In his world, a wealthy man having a young mistress was practically a status symbol. It would be gossiped about for a week and then forgotten. No, Xavier was terrified because of what I had just said. Miss Reynolds, shell companies. He knew that as the chief financial officer of our holding company and the quiet force behind every major deal he had ever closed, I had access to everything. Every bank account, every offshore trust, every single fraudulent document he had signed when he thought I was not paying attention. He had spent the last 2 years siphoning money from our legitimate businesses into fake vendor accounts, setting Gia up as the fall guy, all while trying to slowly push me out of the picture. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought his little HBCU-educated wife was too blindly in love to notice the discrepancies in the ledgers. I leaned closer to Xavier, ignoring the confused and angry stares of his family. I picked up a cloth napkin and gently placed it over the spilled champagne on the table. You look pale, Xavier, I said softly, my voice carrying only to his ears. Are you worried about the initial public offering tomorrow? Or are you just realizing that the $50 million mezzanine loan you secured last month has a very specific morality clause attached to it? A clause that allows the primary creditor to recall the debt immediately upon evidence of financial misconduct. Xavier's breathing became ragged. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip his knees under the table. Nia, he whispered, tears actually welling up in his eyes. Nia, whatever you are doing, stop. You are going to ruin me. You are going to ruin all of us. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the gin and tonic the waiter had just placed in front of me. The ice clinked softly against the glass. I looked at Gia, who was now trembling, realizing that the fairy tale she thought she had secured was rapidly turning into a nightmare. I looked at Tasha, who was still glaring at me, entirely ignorant of the fact that the designer dress she was wearing was paid for by the very same credit line I had frozen 2 hours ago. I am not ruining anything, Xavier. I replied, my voice as cold as the ice in my glass. I am simply restructuring my investments. And as of tonight, you are officially a liability. The music in the ballroom continued to play a lively jazz tune that sharply contrasted with the absolute destruction happening at our table. The guests around us continued to laugh and drink, completely unaware that the supposed billionaire tech genius they were celebrating was currently watching his entire life evaporate before his eyes. Xavier had brought a mistress to a charity gala, thinking he was untouchable. He had let his family disrespect me, thinking I was weak. But the woman sitting beside his mistress was not his victim. I was his reckoning. And this was only the beginning of the longest, most devastating night of his life. I did not wait for Xavier to formulate a pathetic response or for Tasha to hurl another useless insult. I simply stood up, smoothed the skirt of my gown, and walked away from the table. The silence I left behind was absolute. I could feel the weight of their collective panic pressing against my back as I navigated through the crowded ballroom, but I did not look back, not even once. The grand lobby of the Buckhead Plaza Hotel was a stark contrast to the loud, suffocating atmosphere of the gala. It was expansive, lined with towering marble pillars and massive floral arrangements of white orchids. The air was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cedar and lemon polish. I approached the valet stand to request my car, pulling my silk shawl tightly around my shoulders. I was calm. My heart was beating steadily. I had spent 10 years making myself small so Xavier could look big, and walking away from that table felt like taking my first real breath in a decade. But my peace was short-lived. Before the valet could even punch my ticket, I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels striking the marble floor behind me, accompanied by heavy, hurried footsteps. Nia, wait right there. I recognized that commanding, haughty tone instantly. It was Vivian, my mother-in-law. I turned around slowly, my expression perfectly blank. Vivian was marching toward me, her face pinched in fury. She was dressed in a floor-length emerald green gown, her neck dripping with diamonds that I knew for a fact were purchased on credit. Right beside her was DeAndre, Tasha's husband and my deeply entitled brother-in-law. DeAndre was a man who walked with the unearned confidence of someone who always had his bills paid by other people. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket, puffing out his chest as if his sheer presence was supposed to intimidate me. Vivian stopped a few feet away from me, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. She did not bother asking how I was doing. She did not express any outrage over the fact that her son had just paraded his pregnant mistress in front of hundreds of people. In Vivian's world, the only sin was public embarrassment. "What is wrong with you, Nia?" Vivian hissed, looking around nervously to ensure none of the high society guests were within earshot. "Have you completely lost your mind? Coming in here causing a scene at Xavier's table? You are actively trying to destroy the image we have worked so hard to build in this community." I looked at her, tilting my head slightly. "Image," I repeated, my voice dangerously soft. "Your son is sitting in there with a 25-year-old woman who is carrying a child that is not mine. And your biggest concern is the image of this family." Vivian waved her hand dismissively, her diamond bracelets clinking together. "Please grow up, Nia. Men of Xavier's stature have indiscretions. It is the price of doing business, the price of being married to a powerful, successful black man. You think you are the first wife in our circle to deal with something like this. Look at the women in my generation. We stood by our men. We built up our families instead of tearing them apart over petty emotions. You need to swallow your pride and think about the bigger picture. The initial public offering is tomorrow. The entire city is watching us. We are the pinnacle of Black excellence in Atlanta right now. We are the example. I will not let your petty jealousy tear down my son's empire and humiliate us in front of the world." I almost laughed. Her son's empire. It was incredible how fiercely these people protected a kingdom they did not even understand. Vivian stepped closer, her tone shifting from angry to dangerously low and commanding. Here is what is going to happen, Nia. You are going to go home. You are going to pack a bag and go stay at the lake house for a few weeks until the press around the IPO dies down. Then you and Xavier are going to file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. You will take a modest settlement, you will sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you will walk away with dignity. If you try to drag his name through the mud in divorce court, I promise you we will ruin you. We will make sure you never work in the city again. DeAndre stepped forward, chiming in to support his mother-in-law. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, looking down at me with a smirk. Listen to Vivian, Nia. You need to know your place in this dynamic. Xavier pulled you out of some boring corporate cubicle and gave you a life of luxury most people only dream about. You have been riding his coattails for a decade. He gave you the luxury cars, the gated mansion in Buckhead, the lifestyle you could never have achieved on your own. You should be down on your knees thanking him for saving you from a life of mediocrity. The least you can do is bow out gracefully, take your little settlement, and let the man move on with a woman who can actually give him a real heir instead of causing a scene like an angry, bitter ex. The sheer disrespect rolling off DeAndre was astounding. This was a 40-year-old man who had launched 4 separate businesses in the last 5 years, all of which had spectacularly failed. He spent his days playing golf at the country club and posting motivational quotes on social media, pretending to be a self-made entrepreneur while secretly begging Xavier to cover his mortgage every 3 months. He thought I was just the quiet, obedient wife who sat in the background and spent the money. He had no idea that I was the one who actually approved every single dime that entered his bank account. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with their delusions. I just looked at DeAndre with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt. Riding his coattails, I asked, savoring the taste of the words, "Is that what you think I do, DeAndre?" "Yeah, that is exactly what you do," DeAndre scoffed, shifting his weight arrogantly. "Xavier is the visionary. He is the genius. You just balance the checkbooks and go shopping. Do not act like you built anything. Without him, you are nothing. So take the settlement Vivian is offering and disappear before things get ugly for you." I took a step closer to DeAndre. The smirk on his face faltered just a fraction as he saw the absolute deadness in my eyes. "That is a very interesting perspective, DeAndre," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "Tell me something. When Xavier gave you that $5 million seed money last year to launch your so-called luxury logistics company, did he explain where those funds actually came from?" DeAndre frowned, his bravado slipping. He dropped his arms to his sides. "What are you talking about?" "Xavier secured that capital from an angel investor network. He vouched for my business plan." I let out a soft, mocking sigh. "Oh, DeAndre, you really are just as foolish as Tasha." There was no angel investor network. Xavier did not secure anything. Because Xavier's credit has been leveraged to the absolute maximum for the last 3 years, the banks would not even loan him money to buy a used car at this point. Vivian's eyes darted back and forth between us, suddenly looking very unsure of herself. "Nia, what lies are you spouting now?" she demanded. I ignored her, keeping my eyes locked dead on DeAndre. "That $5 million did not come from Xavier," I explained, enunciating every single syllable. "It came from me. Specifically, it came from a high-yield trust fund established by my grandfather, which I control entirely. I authorized the transfer because your wife came crying to me that you were about to lose your house. I am your angel investor, DeAndre. I own 80% of your failing logistics company, and as your majority shareholder, I am calling in the debt, effective immediately." DeAndre's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. His dark skin went visibly pale. "You are lying," he stammered, shaking his head. "Xavier gave me that money. He signed the paperwork." "Xavier signed the paperwork because I allowed him to act as a proxy, so your fragile male ego would not be bruised by the fact that your sister-in-law had to bail you out again," I countered sharply. "But my name is on the deed. My name is on the corporate charter, and my name is on the recall clause. You have 30 days to repay the $5 million, DeAndre. When you inevitably default, I will liquidate your assets. That includes the warehouse, the trucks, and the house you and Tasha are currently sleeping in. DeAndre stumbled backward, actually grabbing the edge of a marble pillar to steady himself. He looked at Vivian, waiting for her to tell him I was lying, but Vivian was completely silent, her face frozen in horror as the reality of my words began to sink in. She was finally realizing that the quiet, well-behaved daughter-in-law she had spent 10 years belittling was not a subordinate. I was the puppet master. Before Vivian could open her mouth to argue, the heavy glass doors of the ballroom burst open behind them. Xavier came sprinting out into the lobby. He was a complete mess. His bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His expensive Tom Ford jacket was slipping off his shoulder, and his face was drenched in sweat. He looked nothing like the billionaire tech mogul he was pretending to be. He looked like a cornered animal. He practically shoved DeAndre out of the way as he lunged toward me, his hands grasping frantically at my upper arm. "Nia," he gasped, his fingers digging into my skin tight enough to bruise. "Nia, do not do this. Do not say another word. You need to come with me right now. Take your hands off me, Xavier," I commanded, my voice echoing sharply off the marble walls. He ignored me, trying to pull me toward the heavy revolving doors leading out to the valet line. The valet was just pulling my black Range Rover up to the curb, the headlights cutting through the darkness. "No, you are getting in the private car with me," Xavier hissed, his eyes wild and desperate. "The reporters are outside. The board members are watching. We are going home, Nia. We are going to sit down and we are going to fix this. You are not going to ruin my life over a stupid mistake. You are my wife. You are supposed to protect me." I yanked my arm violently out of his grip. He stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance on the polished floor. I smoothed the sleeve of my gown, looking at him as if he were a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of my shoe. "I spent 10 years protecting you, Xavier," I said coldly. "I covered your tracks. I paid your debts. I smiled for the cameras, and I let you take the credit for the empire I built with my family's money. I did it because I loved you. I did it because I believed in the vows we took. But you broke those vows the second you moved that girl into the penthouse I paid for. You are not a billionaire. Xavier, you are a fraud, and the protection has officially expired." I turned my back on all three of them. DeAndre was still leaning against the pillar, looking completely sick to his stomach. Vivian was clutching her diamond necklace, her mouth open in silent shock. Xavier was standing in the middle of the lobby chest, heaving, his entire world crashing down around his ears. I walked through the revolving doors, the cool night air hitting my face. The valet held the door of my Range Rover open for me. I slipped into the driver's seat, tipped him a crisp $100 bill, and pressed the push to start button. As I pulled away from the Buckhead Plaza Hotel, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Xavier had run out onto the sidewalk, watching my taillights disappear into the night, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. He had no idea how right he was. The real destruction was only just beginning. The drive back to our Buckhead mansion was the quietest 20 minutes of my life. My hands were steady on the steering wheel of the Range Rover, the tires humming against the smooth asphalt. I did not turn on the radio. I just let the silence wash over me, clearing my mind for the battle that was about to take place within the walls of my own home. I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates and parked in the circular driveway. The house was entirely dark, a sprawling 12,000 square foot testament to the wealth I had carefully managed and grown over the last decade. It was supposed to be our sanctuary. Tonight, it was a war zone. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the grand foyer. I did not bother turning on the main chandelier. I simply walked into the formal living room, poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the wet bar, and sat down on the white leather sofa in the dark. I knew he was coming. I did not have to wait long. 10 minutes later, the front door violently banged open. Xavier stormed into the foyer, his heavy footsteps echoing off the marble floors. He flicked on the lights, illuminating the room and spotting me sitting calmly in the corner. His tuxedo was completely ruined now, the jacket discarded somewhere between the hotel and here, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked exhausted, frantic and cornered. For a moment he just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to read my expression. When he realized I was not going to scream or throw things at him, he immediately switched tactics. The aggressive, desperate man from the hotel lobby vanished. In his place stood the victim. Xavier let his shoulders slump. He walked over to the sofa across from me and collapsed into it, too, burying his face in his hands. Nia, I am so sorry, he whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I am so unbelievably sorry. You were never supposed to find out like this. You were never supposed to see her. I took a sip of my water, my face a mask of absolute indifference. Go on, Xavier. Tell me how this is somehow my fault. Tell me how the stress of your incredible success drove you into the arms of a 25-year-old Instagram model. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, playing the role of a broken man perfectly. It is the pressure, Nia, he pleaded, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. You know what I have been dealing with for the last 2 years. The board members breathing down my neck. The media scrutinizing every move I make. The weight of this upcoming initial public offering is crushing me. I am supposed to be the face of Black excellence in the tech real estate world. Do you know how heavy that crown is? Every single day I wake up terrified that I'm going to lose it all, that I'm going to let everyone down. He reached out, trying to take my hand, but I pulled it away. He sighed heavily, a practiced sound of defeat. Gia means nothing to me, Nia. She is just a distraction, a stupid, meaningless distraction from the anxiety. When I am with her, I do not have to think about the SEC filings or the corporate debt or the investors. She does not ask me about profit margins like you do. I love you. I have only ever loved you. We built this life together, and I am begging you not to throw away 10 years of marriage over a moment of weakness. I looked at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of disgust. A moment of weakness, I repeated flatly. Xavier, you moved her into a luxury penthouse. You are parading her around in public. Your sister is bragging about the child she is carrying. That is not a moment of weakness. That is an entirely separate life. And you did it all using the financial infrastructure that I built and maintained for you. When the victim card failed to elicit my sympathy, a dark shadow crossed Xavier's face. The fake tears dried up instantly. His posture straightened, and the warmth completely drained from his eyes. He realized he could not manipulate my emotions, so he decided to attack my security. Xavier stood up, walked out of the living room, and headed down the hall to his private study. I heard a safe click open, followed by the rustling of thick paper. A minute later, he walked back into the living room and tossed a thick, legally bound document onto the glass coffee table directly in front of me. What is this? I asked, not bothering to reach for it. That is your reality check, Xavier said coldly. His voice was entirely devoid of the affection he had faked just moments ago. It is a post-nuptial agreement. I had my legal team drafted up 3 months ago when I realized you were getting too comfortable asking questions about the offshore accounts. I glanced at the cover page. It was a predatory document designed to strip me of every single piece of equity I held in his companies, leaving me with a meager monthly stipend that would barely cover the property taxes on a decent house. You want me to sign away my rights to the empire I funded? I said, keeping my tone carefully neutral. I am not asking you to sign it, Nia. I am telling you to sign it. Xavier sneered, unbuttoning his cuffs and rolling up his sleeves. Because if you do not sign it, and if you try to take me to divorce court to humiliate me, I will destroy you. I will drag your name through the mud so thoroughly that you will never be able to show your face in Atlanta again. You have nothing on me, Xavier, I stated simply. I have been a flawless wife and a perfect chief financial officer. He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You think the truth matters in family court? You think a judge cares about who balanced the checkbooks? Let me explain how this is going to work, Nia. If you try to fight me, my lawyers are going to file for full exclusive custody of Leo. My breath caught in my throat for just a fraction of a second. Leo. Our 7-year-old adopted son. The little boy I had raised since he was 6 months old, the center of my entire universe. Xavier knew exactly where my only vulnerability lay. You would not dare, I whispered, ensuring my voice sounded sufficiently terrified. Try me, Xavier threatened, leaning over the coffee table, his face inches from mine. I will tell the judge that the pressure of the billionaire lifestyle broke you. I will have my legal team bring in psychologists to testify that you are mentally unstable, paranoid, and financially vindictive. I will paint you as an unfit mother who was so obsessed with my business that she neglected her own child. I have the money to tie you up in litigation for the next decade, Nia. I will bleed your trust fund dry with legal fees until you have nothing left to fight with. You will lose Leo. I will make sure you only get supervised visits on alternating weekends, assuming you pass your court-mandated psychiatric evaluations. I stared at him, forcing my eyes to widen in horror. I let my lower lip tremble slightly. I needed him to believe that his threat had completely shattered me. I needed him to feel like he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. And even if you try to freeze my assets, Xavier continued, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. Even if you try to use that little debt recall trick you threatened DeAndre with tonight, it will not work on me. You are too late, Nia. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Xavier chuckled, walking over to the wet bar to pour himself a massive glass of scotch. He took a sip, savoring his supposed victory. I am not stupid, Nia. I knew you would eventually find out about Gia. So I protected myself. Over the last 8 months, I have systematically transferred all of my major liquid assets, the real estate holdings, and the intellectual property rights of the tech firm, into a blind offshore trust based in the Cayman Islands. And guess who the primary beneficiary of that trust is? I looked down at my hands, shaking my head slowly. Not Gia. Gia Reynolds, Xavier confirmed proudly. My beautiful, compliant, trusting Gia. The assets are completely untouchable by a divorce court in the state of Georgia. They belong to her on paper, which means they belong to me in reality. You have no leverage, Nia. You have no money to take. You only have a choice. Sign the post-nuptial agreement, take your little allowance, and keep your mouth shut during the IPO. Or fight me and lose your son forever. I covered my face with my hands. I forced my shoulders to shake, letting out a soft, broken sob. I drew in a ragged breath, sounding completely defeated. I let the tears fall hot and fast, spilling over my fingers and dripping onto my expensive gown. It was the performance of a lifetime. Please, Xavier, I cried, my voice thick with fake desperation. Please do not take Leo away from me. He is my baby. You cannot do this. You cannot just erase me from our lives. Xavier walked over and patted my head condescendingly, the way one might comfort a disobedient dog that had finally learned its place. It does not have to be ugly, Nia. Just do what you are told. Sign the papers tomorrow. I looked up at him through my tears, my makeup perfectly smudged. I cannot think right now. My head is spinning. I need time. Just give me 48 hours. Please, Xavier. Give me 2 days to process this, to look over the document, and to say goodbye to the life I thought we had. Just 48 hours of peace before I sign everything away. Xavier studied my tear-stained face. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, a broken, defeated woman who had finally realized she was entirely outmatched by his brilliance. He smirked, taking another sip of his scotch. 48 hours. Nia. Xavier agreed smoothly. Not a minute more. Take the weekend to cry it out. I'm going to the penthouse to check on Gia. The stress you caused her tonight is not good for the baby. I will be back on Monday morning, and I expect your signature on that document. Thank you, I whispered, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. Xavier turned around, grabbed his keys from the console table, and walked out of the house. I listened carefully to the heavy wooden door clicking shut, followed by the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place. I waited until I heard the engine of his sports car roar to life and fade away down the long driveway. The second the house was completely silent again, my tears vanished. The shaking in my shoulders stopped instantly. My posture straightened, and a cold, genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into the inside pocket of my silk clutch and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. The red light on the top was blinking steadily, having captured every single word of the last 20 minutes. I pressed the stop button and saved the file. Xavier thought he was a genius for transferring his assets into an offshore trust in his mistress's name. He thought he was brilliant for threatening to take my son. He thought he had outplayed the chief financial officer who had literally built his entire corporate structure from the ground up. What Xavier did not realize was that the offshore accounts he just admitted to funding were entirely comprised of embezzled corporate money, money that belonged to the investors of the company about to go public. And by explicitly stating on a crystal clear audio recording that he was using his mistress to hide stolen funds and threatening to commit perjury in family court, he had just handed me the weapon I needed to send him to federal prison. I looked down at the post-nuptial agreement on the coffee table. I did not need 48 hours to cry. I needed 48 hours to prepare the final devastating blow. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and booted up my encrypted laptop. It was time to introduce my husband to the real consequences of his arrogance. I worked through the night, the blue light of my encrypted laptop illuminating the dark office as I meticulously downloaded every ledger, every hidden email, and every wire transfer receipt. By the time the sun began to peek over the Atlanta skyline, painting the room in shades of pale orange, my digital arsenal was complete. I closed the laptop, took a quick shower, and changed into a sharp, tailored burgundy pantsuit. If I was going to war, I was going to look the part. I headed to the kitchen to grab my keys and my wallet. On my way out, I stopped at a high-end local coffee shop in Buckhead. I ordered my usual black coffee and handed the barista my platinum credit card. A moment later, he looked at me with an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, ma'am, but this card is declining. Do you have another one?" I frowned slightly. That was a black card with an unlimited balance. I reached into my wallet and handed him my personal debit card, the one linked to my private checking account that Xavier was a joint signer on purely for emergency purposes. The barista swiped it. He shook his head, declined again. I pulled out a crisp $20 bill, paid for the coffee, and walked out to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat, I pulled up my banking app on my phone. Every single account with my name attached to it that Xavier had any level of access to was frozen. Zero available balances. Red locked icons across the screen. A second later, my phone buzzed with a text message from my husband. It read, "Good morning. Just securing the assets until you sign the post-nuptial agreement. Have a great weekend thinking about your future." Xavier actually thought he was starving me out. He thought by cutting off my credit cards he could force me into submission before Monday morning. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he forgot one crucial detail. The money in those accounts was just surface wealth. It was the flashy money we used for dinners and vacations. The real capital, the foundational wealth that held his entire corporate structure together, was locked away in places he did not even know existed. But to access the master keys to those funds, I needed to go to the company headquarters. The corporate offices of our real estate tech firm occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek glass skyscraper in Midtown Atlanta. I drove straight there, bypassing the valet and parking in my reserved executive spot. When I walked through the double glass doors of the lobby, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The receptionist, who usually greeted me with a bright smile, suddenly looked down at her desk, her face flushing with panic. Whispers rippled through the bullpen as I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms. The employees knew something was wrong. I ignored the stairs and took the private elevator up to the top floor where the executive suites were located. My office was at the end of the hall, a massive corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But as I approached the heavy oak door, I noticed it was propped open. I could hear the loud, obnoxious sound of trap music blaring from inside, accompanied by the shrill sound of Tasha's laughter. I stepped into the doorway and took in the scene. My custom mahogany desk, the one I had sat behind for years while pulling this company out of the red, was covered in fabric swatches and interior design magazines. Tasha was sitting in my ergonomic leather chair, her feet propped up on the desk, holding a cup of green juice. 2 nervous-looking interns were frantically moving my framed diplomas and awards off the walls and placing them into a cardboard box on the floor. Tasha looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. She did not look embarrassed. Instead, she flashed a wide, venomous smile, reveling in what she thought was my ultimate humiliation. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Tasha said, gesturing for the interns to stop working. "You can leave us alone for a minute, boys. Close the door behind you." The interns practically sprinted out of the room, pulling the door shut and leaving me alone with my sister-in-law. I walked slowly into the room, my eyes scanning the cardboard box containing my Spelman College degree and my Wharton MBA. "What are you doing in my office, Tasha?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Tasha let out a loud theatrical sigh and swung her legs off the desk. She stood up, smoothing down her overpriced designer dress. "Correction, Nia. This is my office now. Xavier called me this morning. He told me you are taking an extended leave of absence due to personal stress. He officially appointed me as the new vice president of finance." I stared at her, genuinely trying to process the sheer stupidity of the situation. "You?" I said, repeating the word as if it tasted foul. "Vice president of finance. Tasha, you failed basic algebra in high school. You literally called me last month to ask how to calculate the tip on a restaurant bill." Tasha's face hardened, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "Watch your mouth, Nia. I do not need to do math. That is what calculators and underpaid accountants are for. I am here for the vision." Xavier realized he needs blood loyalty at the top of his company, not just a glorified bookkeeper. "We are $1 billion family now. We are taking this company public tomorrow. Your little HBCU accounting degree just is not needed anymore to manage the kind of wealth we are dealing with. We need someone with class, someone with the right aesthetic for the board of directors." I could not help it. A short, sharp laugh escaped my lips. Tasha thought running a highly leveraged financial tech firm was about aesthetics. She thought a vice president of finance just sat in a corner office picking out curtains and attending luncheons. Xavier was so desperate to lock me out of the building that he had handed the keys to the vault to someone who did not even know how to read a balance sheet. "It is hilarious that you still think you are the smartest person in the room," Tasha sneered, walking around the desk to confront me. "Xavier froze your accounts. He told me everything. You have nothing left, Nia. You are standing in a building you no longer work for, wearing clothes my brother paid for. So grab your little box of cheap degrees and get out of my office before I call security and have you escorted out like a disgruntled employee." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not defend my degrees. I just smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that made Tasha take a half step backward. "Enjoy the new title, Tasha," I said smoothly. "I am sure it will look fantastic on your resume when you are applying for retail jobs next month." Before she could process the insult, I walked right past her, heading toward the large Persian rug that covered the center of the office floor. Tasha frowned, crossing her arms. "What are you doing? I told you to get your things and get out." I ignored her. I crouched down and pulled back the heavy wool corner of the Persian rug, exposing the polished hardwood floor underneath. With a swift, practiced motion, I pressed my thumb against a specific disguised floorboard. It popped open with a quiet mechanical click, revealing a biometric retinal scanner that Xavier did not even know existed. I leaned down, letting the scanner read my eye. A small metal panel slid back, exposing a hidden floor safe. Tasha gasped, her eyes going wide. "What is that?" "Xavier did not say anything about a safe." "That is because Xavier does not know about it," I replied calmly. "And frankly, neither do you." I reached into the dark cavity of the safe and bypassed the stacks of emergency corporate cash and the sensitive legal binders. I grabbed the only thing I had come for, a single encrypted red flash drive. It contained the master authorization codes for the generational trust funds that were acting as the silent guarantors for every single loan Xavier had ever taken out. It was the kill switch to his entire empire. I slipped the red flash drive into the pocket of my blazer, closed the safe, and kicked the Persian rug back into place. I stood up and smoothed my jacket, looking at Tasha one last time. She was staring at the floor, visibly unnerved by the fact that there were secrets in this room she knew nothing about. "I will leave the box of degrees here," I told her politely. "You can throw them away. I really do not need them to prove who I am. Have a wonderful day at the office, Madam Vice President. Try not to bankrupt the company before lunchtime." I turned and walked out of the office, the sound of Tasha yelling my name fading behind the heavy oak door. I walked past the staring employees, stepped into the private elevator, and hit the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended rapidly, I pulled my cell phone from my purse. I dialed a private, unlisted number that routed directly to a highly secure wealth management firm in Geneva. The phone rang only twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks. How can we assist you today?" "Good morning, Julian," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I am authorizing a complete portfolio liquidation regarding the Atlanta Tech holdings." "Understood," the voice replied, tapping rapidly on a keyboard. "Are we restructuring the debt, ma'am?" "No," I answered, stepping out of the elevator and into the bright lobby of the building. "We are not restructuring. Initiate the debt recall protocol. All of it. Call in every single corporate loan, every mezzanine line of credit, and every private mortgage guaranteed by my family's trust. Give them the standard 24-hour notice of default." There was a brief pause on the line. "Ma'am, calling in the debt simultaneously will trigger immediate insolvency for the firm and personal bankruptcy for the primary signers." "I know exactly what it will trigger, Julian," I said, walking out the glass doors into the warm morning sun. "Execute the protocol immediately." "Yes, ma'am. Consider it done." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my purse. Xavier wanted to freeze my checking account and take my office. That was fine. Let him have the office. Because by tomorrow morning he was not even going to own the building. Let him play his little games with his mistress and his ignorant sister. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I spent the rest of Saturday finalizing the digital paperwork with Julian, ensuring that by Monday morning the financial avalanche would be unstoppable. By Sunday afternoon, I only had one priority left for the weekend. I needed to pick up my son Leo. He had been staying at Vivian's house for the weekend, a pre-arranged visit that I refused to cancel just because my husband was a coward. Vivian hosted a family cookout every final Sunday of the month. In the Black community, a Sunday cookout is sacred ground. It is a place of unity, loud music, dominoes slamming on folding tables, and the smell of hickory smoke in the air. But in Vivian's backyard, it was merely a stage for her to flaunt her supposed high society status to anyone who would listen. I pulled my Range Rover up to the curb outside her massive brick estate in Alpharetta. The street was lined with expensive cars, most of which I knew were leased under the corporate account I had just flagged for default. As I walked through the side gate into the sprawling backyard, the sound of a classic R&B track playing over the outdoor speakers was nearly drowned out by the loud, performative laughters of my in-laws. I scanned the yard for my son. Leo was playing tag near the deep end of the pool with his cousins, his bright laughter bringing a genuine smile to my face for the first time in days. I was about to call out to him when I saw her. Gia was sitting right in the center of the patio, perfectly positioned under a massive designer umbrella. She was wearing a flowing white sundress, her hand resting delicately on her slightly protruding stomach. Vivian was sitting right next to her, patting her shoulder affectionately, while a group of aunts and cousins hovered around them like loyal subjects. Xavier was standing nearby, holding a plate of barbecue ribs, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He had actually brought his pregnant mistress to a family cookout while he was still legally married to me. It was the ultimate display of disrespect, a calculated move orchestrated by Vivian to formally introduce Gia into the family fold and push me out entirely. I did not turn around and leave. I walked straight onto the stone patio, my head held high, the heels of my sandals clicking sharply against the flagstone. The lively chatter died down almost instantly as people noticed me. Aunts who usually hugged me suddenly found their potato salad incredibly interesting. Uncles who used to ask me for stock advice suddenly needed to check the temperature on the grill. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Vivian announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the yard could hear her. Her voice dripped with pure condescension. "I am just here to pick up Leo, Vivian," I said smoothly, not breaking my stride. "I am not staying long enough to ruin your afternoon." Tasha walked over holding a large stack of red plastic cups. She looked me up and down, a smug grin plastered on her face. "Since you are here, Nia, be useful for once. Go into the kitchen and bring out the rest of the paper plates and the extra serving spoons. We have a very special guest today, and we want to make sure Gia is completely comfortable." She shoved the cups toward me, treating me like the hired help in front of 30 people. Xavier watched this happen. He did not say a single word to defend me. He just took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes silently daring me to make a scene and prove his false narrative that I was a bitter, unstable woman. I did not take the cups. I just looked at Tasha with a pitying expression, sidestepped her completely, and walked directly toward the seating area where Gia was holding court. Gia saw me approaching and immediately leaned into her victim persona. She shrank back into her chair, looking up at Vivian with wide, doe-like eyes, as if I were a predator about to attack her. Onia Gia said, her voice breathy and trembling slightly. "Please do not be mad at me. I never meant to hurt you. Xavier and I just fell in love. You cannot control who your heart chooses. I just want us to have peace for the sake of the new baby." A few of the older aunts murmured in agreement, completely buying into her innocent, helpless act. Vivian glared at me, leaning forward protectively. "You heard her, Nia. She just wants peace. So collect your son and go before you ruin the energy here." I stopped right in front of Gia. She was wearing the $2 million diamond necklace Xavier had purchased using corporate funds. She looked so proud of herself, so convinced that she had won the ultimate prize. "I am not mad at you, Gia," I said, keeping my tone incredibly polite and conversational. "Actually, I am quite impressed. Xavier tells me you are stepping into a very serious role tomorrow after the initial public offering, the new philanthropic partner of the tech empire. That is a massive responsibility for someone your age." Gia perked up instantly, her vanity easily overpowering her fake fear. The opportunity to brag in front of the family was too tempting for her to pass up. She sat up straighter, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Yes, well, Xavier knows how passionate I am about giving back to the community. He just put a $10 million charity foundation entirely in my name. I am the sole director. It is going to be focused on underprivileged youth. We are going to do amazing things." The family members nearby let out audible gasps of awe. $10 million. Vivian beamed with pride, looking around to make sure everyone heard the staggering number. Tasha sneered at me from across the patio, clearly thrilled that Gia was replacing me not just in Xavier's bed, but in the corporate hierarchy as well. "That is wonderful, Gia," I replied, offering her a bright, enthusiastic smile. "Managing a $10 million foundation is a huge undertaking. Have you already filed the IRS Form 990 for this fiscal year?" Gia blinked. Her confident smile faltered. "The what?" "The Form 99. "Oh," I repeated, speaking slowly and clearly as if explaining a basic concept to a child. "And I assume you have fully secured your 501c3 tax-exempt status, right? Because as the sole director, you are personally liable for the operational compliance. If the foundation is receiving offshore transfers from Xavier's holding companies without the proper philanthropic audits, the federal government views that as direct wire fraud. But I am sure you already knew that when you signed the papers designating yourself as the primary beneficiary." The patio went dead silent. Gia looked completely clueless, her eyes darting nervously around the yard. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had no idea what a Form 990 was. She did not know what a 501c3 was. She just liked the idea of being called a director and having millions of dollars attached to her name. She had no idea she was legally holding the bag for a massive financial crime, but Xavier knew. I heard the loud clatter of a plate hitting the flagstone behind me. I turned around to see Xavier standing near the grill, his face entirely devoid of color. The ribs he had been holding were scattered across the ground. He was staring at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly as panic seized him for the second time in 3 days. He realized right then that my questions were not random. I was not just trying to embarrass his mistress with corporate jargon. I was letting him know exactly how deep my knowledge went. I knew about the foundation. I knew it was not a real charity. I knew he was using it to wash $10 million of embezzled corporate funds before the IPO, and I knew he had tricked Gia into putting her signature on every single fraudulent document. "What are you talking about, Nia?" Vivian demanded, breaking the silence. Her voice lacked its usual authority. "Stop trying to confuse the girl with your accounting terms." I turned back to Gia. "Just make sure your lawyer reviews those documents," I said gently. "The feds are rarely sympathetic to the 'I just fell in love' defense when it comes to wire fraud." Gia swallowed hard. She looked at Xavier, silently begging him to explain. But Xavier could not look at her. He was paralyzed by sheer fear. I walked away, calling my son. Leo, time to go home. As we left the yard, I knew Xavier finally understood. You never go to war with the person who built your armor. By Monday morning, my armor was fully weaponized. I sat in the corner office of Sterling and Associates, widely known as the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the entire state of Georgia, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the downtown Atlanta skyline. Across the polished mahogany desk sat Valerie Sterling, a remarkably high-powered attorney worth every single penny she billed. But we were not looking at each other. Our eyes were locked on the flat-screen television. Xavier had decided to go on the offensive. He was sitting on the brightly lit set of the Morning Business Report, a nationally syndicated financial news show broadcast to millions of viewers. He looked sharp, composed, and entirely fake. He wore a crisp navy suit, confidently projecting the carefully manufactured image of a seasoned chief executive officer. Beside him, tightly clutching his hand, sat Gia in a demure pink pantsuit playing the devoted inspirational muse perfectly. The host leaned forward eagerly. Xavier, your massive real estate tech firm is officially going public tomorrow morning. This initial public offering is projected to be one of the largest in Atlanta's history. How are you handling the pressure? Xavier smiled humbly. It is a monumental moment for the culture. I started this company with a vision to revolutionize urban real estate for marginalized communities. I wanted to create a path for true generational wealth. But as you climb the mountain of success, you realize that not everyone is equipped to handle the altitude. Some people are satisfied with just being comfortable, while I'm trying to build an empire that outlasts us all. The host raised an eyebrow. Are you referring to the persistent rumors regarding your recent marital separation? Xavier let out a heavy, perfectly timed sigh. Yes, it is deeply unfortunate. When you are building a legacy, you need a partner who understands the vision, focused on giving back, not just hoarding wealth. Unfortunately, my soon-to-be ex-wife and I grew apart. She became very bitter, very focused on the money, and she lost sight of the philanthropic soul of this enterprise. I needed a partner who shared my passion for the people. Gia squeezed his hand, gazing at him with manufactured adoration. Xavier turned to her, his smile widening. That is why I am so incredibly proud to introduce Gia Reynolds. She is not just the love of my life. She is my new philanthropic partner. Tomorrow, alongside the IPO, we are launching a $10 million charity foundation, directed entirely by Gia, aimed at uplifting underprivileged neighborhoods, because true wealth is about what you give back. Valerie muted the television. She leaned back in her leather chair, steeping her fingers. Her expression was the mark of a woman who destroyed arrogant men for a living. Well, Valerie said smoothly, he is certainly committing to the narrative, painting you as the greedy, bitter ex-wife who could not handle his brilliance while simultaneously admitting on national television that he is funding a $10 million shell foundation with pre-IPO corporate capital. I have seen men hang themselves before, Nia, but your husband is building his own gallows, buying the rope and tying the knot on a live broadcast. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling completely calm. A year ago, watching the man I loved sit on national television and lie about my character would have destroyed me. I would have been crying hysterically, calling his phone, begging him to stop. I would have logged onto every social media platform, typing out frantic paragraphs, trying to defend my name against his army of followers. I would have played right into his trap, looking exactly like the unhinged, unstable woman he was trying to convince the world I was. But today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical focus. I am not going to respond to it, I told Valerie. Let him do his press tour. Let him soak up the applause. Let Tasha and Vivian share the interview on their pages and brag about their new philanthropic superstar. The higher he climbs today, the harder the impact will be tomorrow. Valerie nodded approvingly. Silence is the ultimate luxury of the truly powerful. Most women would want to issue a cease and desist right now for defamation. But you understand the assignment, Naya. We only care about the court of law. And right now, he is handing the Securities and Exchange Commission a beautifully packaged confession. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer. What is the status of the offshore accounts? Valerie slid a sleek black leather folder across the desk. The Geneva wealth management firm confirmed your instructions at 6 o'clock this morning. The debt recall protocol has been fully initiated. Xavier's primary holding company is now officially in default on $50 million worth of mezzanine loans. The offshore accounts he transferred into Gia's name were immediately flagged by international banking authorities due to the discrepancy in the signatory rights. He thought he was hiding his money in the Cayman Islands. Instead, he essentially trapped it in a frozen vault that only you have the legal right to unlock. I opened the folder. The crisp white pages inside were filled with dense legal jargon, but to me they read like poetry. These were the consequences of taking my loyalty for granted. These were the receipts for every late night I spent balancing his books, every time I covered DeAndre's ridiculous debts, and every time I smiled politely while Vivian insulted my education. Are the eviction notices ready? I asked, pulling a heavy Mont Blanc pen from my purse. Valerie tapped a manicured fingernail against a separate stack of documents on the corner of her desk. Ready and waiting. As the primary lien holder of the family properties, you have the absolute right to execute the default clauses. Vivian's estate in Alpharetta Tasha and DeAndre's house, and the corporate warehouse leased to DeAndre's failing logistics company. They have all breached the terms of their financial agreements by failing to secure the secondary collateral, which Xavier conveniently forgot to tell them was tied directly to his now frozen credit lines. I uncapped my pen. I started with Vivian's house. I thought about the way she had looked at me just yesterday at the cookout, treating me like a servant in a house that my grandfather's money had purchased. I remembered how she constantly mocked my HBCU education, implying it was inferior while happily living off the dividends it produced. I signed my name with a smooth, decisive stroke. Next was Tasha's house. I thought about her sitting behind my mahogany desk, kicking her feet up, telling me my degree was worthless because she was part of a billion-dollar family. I thought about the countless times she had conveniently forgotten her wallet at expensive dinners, expecting me to quietly pick up the tab while she paraded around in designer clothes I ultimately paid for. I signed my name again, sealing her fate. Then came DeAndre's warehouse. I remembered his smug face in the hotel lobby, telling me to get on my knees and thank his brother for saving me from mediocrity. I pressed the pen down hard, signing the final authorization. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk toward Valerie. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was 9 in the morning. Xavier would be leaving the television studio right about now, heading to the corporate headquarters to pop champagne with his sister and prepare for the ringing of the bell tomorrow. He would be checking his phone, expecting angry texts from me, expecting to see me unraveling into chaos. Valerie picked up the folder. Her eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. We have process servers standing by in every designated zone, she said. They are highly trained professionals. They do not accept excuses, they do not accept delays, and they certainly do not care if the recipient is having a bad day. They will execute these orders with absolute precision. I looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city below. I had spent 10 years building a kingdom for a man who did not respect the architect. He had used my bricks to build his throne, and now he was trying to invite another woman to sit beside him. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who controlled the foundation, and I was pulling it right out from under him. I took a deep breath, feeling the last remnants of my old submissive self fade away into the air-conditioned atmosphere of the office. I turned my gaze away from the window and looked directly into my lawyer's eyes. My voice was completely steady, devoid of anger, devoid of sadness. It was the voice of a woman who was finally taking her life back. Serve the papers, all of them, today. By 7 o'clock that evening, the coastal marina in Savannah was illuminated by the blinding lights of the Obsidian, a magnificent triple-decker mega-yacht that Xavier used as his floating palace. He had flown his top investors' board members and, of course, his deeply entitled family down to the coast for an extravagant pre-initial public offering celebration. The air was thick with the smell of sea salt, expensive cigars, and roasted seafood. I stood at the edge of the private dock, watching the spectacle from the shadows. The yacht was glowing with neon blue underwater lights. A live jazz band was playing on the upper deck. Women in designer evening gowns and men in tailored linen suits were clinking crystal glasses. At the very center of the upper deck, standing near the railing with a microphone in his hand, was Xavier. He was in his element, wearing a white tuxedo jacket, holding his glass of champagne high. Beside him stood Gia, wearing a tight sequined dress, playing her role as the adoring philanthropic partner. I could hear his booming voice carrying over the water, amplified by the expensive sound system. To vision, Xavier proclaimed, his voice dripping with arrogance. To the kind of relentless drive that turns a simple idea into a billion-dollar legacy. They told me I could not build an empire, but look at us tonight. We are redefining Black excellence. We are making history. The crowd erupted into applause. My mother-in-law Vivian was clapping the loudest, beaming with pride. Tasha and DeAndre were standing right near the front, drinking heavily and taking selfies to post on their social media accounts, desperate to show the world how important they were. They were celebrating a victory they had not earned with money that was not theirs. It was the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under them. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly toward the boarding ramp. Two massive security guards in black suits immediately stepped in front of me, crossing their arms to block my path. "Excuse me, ma'am," the taller guard said gruffly. "This is a private event, guest list only." I did not stop walking. I simply reached into my clutch, pulled out a thick document embossed with a gold seal, and held it up to his face. "This vessel is the Obsidian," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the ocean breeze. "It is legally registered to Apex Holding Group, of which I am the sole managing director. You are currently standing on my property. Step aside, or I will have you arrested for trespassing." The guard glanced at the document, saw my name explicitly listed as the primary owner, and immediately stepped back, his tough demeanor evaporating. He unclipped the velvet rope and gestured for me to board. I walked up the ramp, my heels striking the teakwood deck with a steady, rhythmic thud. I was wearing a striking crimson-red dress, a color chosen deliberately. I wanted them to see me coming. I wanted them to know that the woman they tried to erase was the very one holding the knife to their throats. I bypassed the lower deck entirely, making my way up the spiraling glass staircase to the main party. The moment I stepped onto the upper deck, the atmosphere shifted. It was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The investors who recognized me whispered to one another, their eyes darting between me and Xavier. The jazz band faltered for a second before awkwardly continuing to play. Xavier was still at the microphone, laughing at something a board member had said when he finally turned and saw me. The smile fell off his face so fast it was almost comical. The microphone let out a sharp, piercing screech of feedback as his hand dropped to his side. Gia gasped and instinctively took a step behind him, using him as a shield. But it was Tasha who reacted first. Emboldened by her new, entirely fraudulent title of Vice President of Finance, she stormed across the deck toward me. Her face was flushed with alcohol and fury. "What the hell do you think you are doing here, Nia?" Tasha demanded, pointing a manicured finger an inch from my face. "Did you not get the memo? You are out. You are done. This is an executive event for the new leadership team and our investors. You are not welcome here." I looked at Tasha, completely unfazed by her outburst. "Tasha, you have been the Vice President of Finance for exactly 8 hours, I replied smoothly. "And yet you are currently drinking a vintage Dom Perignon that I personally ordered on a yacht that I legally own, celebrating an IPO that I engineered. Do not speak to me about leadership." Tasha let out a loud, mocking laugh, turning to look at the investors nearby to make sure they were watching her defend her brother's honor. "You own this yacht," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You are completely delusional. Xavier bought this boat 2 years ago. Security. Get this crazy woman off the deck before she ruins the celebration." "Security is not going to help you, Tasha," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the murmurs of the crowd, "but the waitstaff might." At my exact words, 4 men dressed impeccably in the white tuxedo uniforms of the catering company stopped circulating with their trays of hors d'oeuvres. They set their silver platters down on the nearest tables in perfect unison. They were not waiters. They were the highly trained process servers Valerie had promised me. The first server walked directly up to Xavier, pulling a thick manila envelope from inside his white jacket. Xavier Brooks, the server, stated loudly, pressing the envelope firmly against Xavier's chest. "You have been served." Xavier stumbled back, clutching the envelope as if it were a bomb. The second server approached Vivian, who was standing frozen near the bar. "Vivian Brooks, you have been served." Vivian let out a sharp gasp, dropping her champagne flute. It shattered against the teak deck, the expensive liquid pooling around her designer shoes. The third server stepped right in front of DeAndre, who tried to turn and walk away, but the man was faster, shoving the envelope into his hands. "DeAndre Thomas, you have been served." The final server walked right up to Tasha, who was still standing inches away from me. He held out the heavy envelope. She stared at it, her mouth hanging open in shock. "Tasha Thomas," the server said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You have been served." Tasha refused to take it, so he simply dropped it at her feet. The upper deck descended into absolute chaos. The investors were backing away, frantically muttering to each other, realizing that the company they were about to pour millions of dollars into was currently imploding in real time. Xavier ripped open his envelope, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His hands began to shake violently. "Nia, what is this?" he choked out, his voice cracking. "What did you do?" I walked slowly toward the center of the deck, making sure every single investor, board member, and family member could hear my next words perfectly. I did exactly what I promised I would do. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. I restructured my investments. "Xavier, the document you are holding is a formal notice of default. The $50 million mezzanine loan that floats your entire corporate structure has been recalled due to your blatant violation of the morality and financial misconduct clauses." I froze. "The offshore accounts you illegally transferred into Gia's name this morning. You have no capital. You have no leverage. The initial public offering tomorrow is completely dead." The investors gasped collectively. A few of them immediately pulled out their phones, frantically dialing their own legal teams. Xavier looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at Gia, then at his mother, then finally at me, realizing the absolute magnitude of his miscalculation. And as for the rest of you, I continued turning my attention to Vivian, Tasha, and DeAndre. "Those envelopes contain your eviction notices. Vivian, you have 24 hours to vacate the Alpharetta estate. DeAndre, your warehouse is being padlocked at midnight tonight. Tasha, the house you are currently living in is going into foreclosure by Friday. You wanted to be a billionaire family so desperately. You wanted to look down on me and my education while living off the wealth I generated. Well, the free ride is officially over. Welcome back to reality." Vivian clutched her chest, leaning heavily against the bar, looking as if she were about to faint. DeAndre was staring at his envelope with blank, uncomprehending horror. Tasha was shaking her head repeatedly, denying the reality unfolding in front of her. "You cannot do this!" Tasha screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "We are family. You cannot just throw us out on the street." "You told me to leave the family table, Tasha," I reminded her coldly. "I simply took the table with me." I turned my gaze back to Xavier, who was standing completely paralyzed by the railing. "Oh, and Xavier," I added, offering him one final devastating smile. "There is one more thing. You might want to ask your guests to finish their drinks quickly. I am repossessing the yacht, effective immediately. The Coast Guard is waiting at the edge of the marina to escort this vessel back to my private dry dock. Everyone has exactly 15 minutes to disembark before they are charged with federal trespassing." The sheer panic that erupted on the upper deck was like watching a play suddenly catch fire. The investors did not wait for Xavier to explain. They recognized a sinking ship. Within seconds, men and women in evening gowns were sprinting toward the glass staircase, desperate to get off the obsidian before their names were officially associated with a federal trespassing charge or corporate fraud scandal. They shoved past Tasha and DeAndre, ignoring Xavier, frantically pleading for them to stay and listen to reason. Xavier grabbed the arm of his lead investor, a wealthy venture capitalist from Chicago. "Richard, please," Xavier begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is just a misunderstanding. My wife is just upset. I can fix this. I have the assets." Richard yanked his arm away. his expression filled with absolute disgust. You do not have anything, Xavier. She just recalled your primary debt facility. Your company is completely insolvent. Do not ever contact my office again. As Richard hurried down the stairs, a sharp ringtone cut through the chaos. It came from Vivian and her diamond-encrusted clutch. She had collapsed into a lounge chair, still clutching the eviction notice to her chest. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking so violently, she dropped it twice before finally answering. "Hello, Vivian," said her voice weak and trembling. From where I stood, I could hear the frantic voice of Maria, who was Vivian, and her longtime housekeeper screaming through the receiver. Vivian put the phone on speaker, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "Mrs. Brooks, you need to come home right now!" Maria yelled, her voice echoing across the deck. "There are moving trucks pulling up to the gates. Men with legal badges are changing the locks on the front doors. They are boxing up the furniture. They told me I have to leave the property immediately." Vivian let out a guttural scream. She dropped the phone on the teak deck and lunged toward Xavier, grabbing the lapels of his ruined tuxedo jacket. "Do something!" she shrieked, shaking him violently. "Xavier, tell them to stop. They are taking my house. My house. The estate. Tell this crazy woman to stop it right now." Xavier was completely paralyzed. He looked at his mother, then at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He had spent his entire adult life projecting the image of the all-powerful, untouchable patriarch, the billionaire genius who provided for his family. But in that moment, stripped of my financial protection, he looked exactly like what he truly was. A frightened little boy caught playing dress-up in clothes he could not afford. Tasha pushed her mother aside, marching up to me with tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You are a monster, Nia," she screamed, pointing her finger at my chest. "How can you do this to your own family?" Xavier built this empire from the ground up. He worked day and night to give us this life. He is a self-made billionaire. You cannot just swoop in here out of jealousy and steal everything he created because he found a woman who actually appreciates him. I looked at Tasha. Gia was still cowering behind Xavier, watching the destruction with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the billionaire she had attached herself to was actually broke. Self-made. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. I let out a slow, dark laugh that made Tasha take a step back. "There is no such thing as a self-made billionaire in this family, Tasha. Your brother did not build an empire. He built a house of cards, and he used my family and our money to pay for the glue." Xavier closed his eyes, a tear finally slipping down his cheek, as the ultimate truth he had hidden for a decade was finally dragged into the light. "Let me educate you on the reality of your luxurious lifestyle," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sound of the waves hitting the hull. 10 years ago, Xavier was a struggling real estate agent with terrible credit and a handful of failed commercial leases. He had the vision, I will give him that. But vision without capital is just a hallucination. When the banks laughed him out of their offices, it was not his brilliance that saved him. It was my grandfather. Vivian stopped crying, her head snapping up to look at me. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "I am talking about generational wealth, Vivian," I said coldly. "Real wealth. Not the flashy leased cars and the designer bags you parade around Atlanta to impress your country club friends. I am talking about the kind of quiet, deep-rooted capital that my family built over 3 generations. When Xavier needed funding for his first tech acquisition, my family trust provided a $50 million mezzanine loan to act as the foundational capital. I structured the deal. I managed the ledgers. I kept the secret so his fragile ego would not shatter. Every single dollar this company generated was heavily leveraged against my collateral. I took a step closer to Vivian, looking down at her crumpled form on the lounge chair. "Your massive brick estate in Alpharetta. Did you really think Xavier bought that with his year-end bonus? It was purchased under a subsidiary holding company that I control. You have been living in my house for 5 years, Vivian. While you were busy making snide remarks about my education and telling me I needed to learn my place. You slept under a roof that my ancestors paid for." Vivian buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her shattered social standing crushed her. I turned my attention to Tasha and DeAndre. DeAndre was leaning heavily against the yacht, and its polished wooden railing looking physically sick. Tasha was staring at me in pure denial, shaking her head side to side. "And what about us?" Tasha demanded, her voice barely a whisper now. "My cars, the house, DeAndre and his business. You are telling me Xavier did not pay for any of that?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Xavier could not afford the insurance on those luxury cars, Tasha. I approved the corporate leases for your Range Rover and your husband and his Mercedes. I signed off on the down payment for your house using emergency company funds because Xavier begged me to keep you off his back. And DeAndre and his incredible logistics company, the one he is always bragging about on social media. I am the sole guarantor of the warehouse lease and the angel investor who provided the $5 million seed money. Without me, DeAndre is just an unemployed man in a very expensive suit. DeAndre did not say a word. He just stared at the wooden deck. The arrogance he had displayed in the hotel lobby was gone. "You are all frauds," I stated, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the deserted upper deck. "You built your entire identities on the myth of black excellence, but you contributed absolutely nothing to it. You thought you were untouchable because you had Xavier protecting you. But Xavier was only powerful because I allowed him to be. I am the bank. I am the board. I am the absolute authority in this dynamic, and I am officially cutting off your funding today." Xavier finally found his voice. "Nia, please." He begged, his voice thick with tears. "You proved your point. You won. You completely humiliated us. Just call the lawyers. Stop the evictions. Let us sit down and negotiate this like adults. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave Gia. Just do not take everything." I looked at the man I had loved for 10 years. I looked at the fear in his eyes, the absolute desperation, and I felt absolutely nothing. "There is nothing left to negotiate, Xavier," I replied, my tone as hard as diamond. "I told you I needed 48 hours to process your postnuptial agreement. I used that time to execute the default clauses you thought I was too soft and too emotionally attached to use. The paperwork is filed. The asset freezes are permanent." I looked at the group of them huddled together in their expensive, useless clothes. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the properties I delivered the final ultimatum. Take your personal clothes and leave. If you attempt to take any fixtures, any vehicles, or any corporate assets, my legal team will file criminal theft charges against all of you." The horn of the Coast Guard vessel sounded loudly from the edge of the marina, signaling their approach to impound the yacht. "Your 15 minutes are up," I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the glass staircase. "Have a safe walk home because your cars are gone." The sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, casting a golden light over the glass and steel skyline. It was supposed to be a historic day. The day our real estate tech firm went public. The day Xavier was supposed to ring the bell on Wall Street and cement his legacy as a self-made billionaire. Instead, the corporate headquarters was buzzing with a frantic, terrified energy. Rumors of the yacht repossession and the sudden asset freezes had already infected the executive floors. Employees were whispering in the break rooms, avoiding eye contact, and executives were aggressively dialing their attorneys, desperate to distance themselves. But Xavier, driven by a toxic cocktail of arrogance and sheer desperation, still believed he could salvage his sinking ship. At exactly 8 o'clock sharp, the executive board of directors gathered in the main glass-walled conference room. These were 12 of the most ruthless, influential venture capitalists and financial advisors in the state of Georgia, men who did not tolerate failure. They were murmuring anxiously, checking their phones and demanding answers. The heavy mahogany doors swung open and Xavier walked in. He was trying desperately to project the same unshakable confidence he had worn on national television just 24 hours ago, but the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed him. And right beside him, looking completely out of her depth, was Gia. She was wearing a severely tailored black business suit that looked more like a costume than professional attire. She clutched a leather briefcase to her chest, her eyes darting around the room full of imposing, wealthy executives. Xavier actually pulled out a chair for her near the head of the table, treating her like a visiting dignitary. "What is the meaning of this, Xavier?" demanded Richard, the lead investor who had stormed off the yacht the night before. Why are we hearing that the primary debt facility has been recalled? Why are there process servers showing up at your mother's house? And who is this woman? This is a closed board meeting for the initial public offering vote. Xavier raised his hands, forcing a calm, reassuring smile. Gentlemen, please, take a seat. We are experiencing a minor internal restructuring hiccup due to some unfortunate personal matters with my soon-to-be ex-wife. She is attempting to weaponize her family's trust fund to derail this initial public offering out of spite. But I assure you the company is fully solvent. In fact, I have brought Gia Reynolds here today because as of this morning, she represents the holding company that controls 51% of our liquid assets. She is our new majority shareholder, and she is fully prepared to authorize the necessary capital injections to override the debt recall. She cannot authorize anything, Xavier, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I walked through the mahogany doors flanked by Valerie Sterling and two other senior partners from her prestigious law firm. The entire boardroom fell dead silent. I was wearing a sharp charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, severe style. I did not walk to my usual seat halfway down the table. I walked directly to the head of the table, my footsteps echoing with absolute authority, stopping right behind the oversized leather executive chair that Xavier had always arrogantly claimed as his own. Nia, you are not welcome here. Xavier snapped, his voice rising in panic. You are not a board member. You are a disgruntled employee on administrative leave. I am calling security right now to have you escorted out of the building. Do not embarrass yourself further, Xavier, I replied coldly, placing my briefcase on the polished mahogany wood. As the sole guarantor of the $50 million mezzanine loan that you just defaulted on, I have exercised the executive step in rights outlined in Section 4 of your operating agreement. I am not just a board member today. I am the acting chairman of this board. So I highly suggest you sit down and remain quiet while I explain to your investors exactly what you have been doing with their money. Richard and the other board members immediately sat down, their eyes fixed on me. They recognized authority when they saw it, and they recognized that Xavier was completely powerless. Xavier stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, looking at Gia for support. But Gia was shrinking into her chair, staring at the thick legal folders my lawyers were now distributing to every seat at the table. She looked like a child who had wandered into a war zone. I opened my folder, my eyes sweeping across the anxious faces of the board. Gentlemen, the narrative Xavier has been spinning to the media and to you is that I am a bitter wife trying to ruin a successful company over a marital dispute. He wants you to believe this is just a messy divorce bleeding into the boardroom. The reality is much more dangerous for your portfolios and your professional reputations. Xavier has not been building a tech empire. He has been running a highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme, and he has been doing it right under your noses for the last 2 years. I pointed to the first tab in the red folders in front of them. Please turn to page 3. You will see a detailed ledger of the corporate funds Xavier allocated for the so-called community outreach initiatives over the last 24 months. He claimed these funds were being used to purchase undervalued real estate in marginalized neighborhoods. He used these projections to secure millions in additional venture capital from all of you. However, if you look at the corresponding wire transfers on page 4, you will see that those funds never reached any property sellers. There were no community outreach programs. There was no urban development. The board members flipped through the pages. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rustling of heavy paper and the heavy, ragged breathing coming from Xavier. The numbers were undeniable, perfectly organized, and brutally clear. Those funds, I continued, my voice unwavering, were routed through 3 separate offshore shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. Companies that Xavier personally established to launder your investments. He used your money to purchase a $2 million diamond necklace, a luxury penthouse in Buckhead, and a fleet of imported sports cars for his deeply entitled brother-in-law. He has siphoned over $12 million of pre-initial public offering capital to fund his personal lifestyle, his family's vanity, and his extramarital affairs. This is an absolute verifiable lie, Xavier shouted violently, slamming his fist down on the heavy wooden table. The sound echoed sharply, but nobody flinched. She deliberately fabricated every single one of these documents. She is trying to frame me because I left her. You cannot believe a word she says. She is a jealous, unstable woman. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked on Richard, whose face was currently turning a dangerous shade of crimson. You will also find I told the board, ignoring Xavier's outburst, the signed affidavits from the international banking authorities verifying every single transaction. I have provided the digital footprints, the IP addresses, and the corresponding dates matching his travel schedules. Furthermore, this morning I submitted this entire portfolio directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Xavier has explicitly violated the corporate morality clause, the fiduciary duty clause, and several federal wire fraud statutes. Richard threw the folder down on the table, sending a pen skittering across the polished surface. He turned his furious gaze toward Xavier, looking as though he wanted to physically strangle him. "You stole from us!" Richard hissed, his voice trembling with unchecked anger. "You took our investment capital and bought jewelry for your mistress. You sat in my office and told me we were changing the world, and you were just lining your own pockets like a common thief." "Richard, listen to me." Xavier begged, sweat pouring down his face, his confident billionaire facade completely shattered. "The assets are secure. I promise you the money is not gone. Gia controls the trust. I put everything in her name to protect it from the divorce courts. We can liquidate the trust today and repay the corporate accounts before the SEC even opens the file. We can still ring the bell tomorrow. The money is safe." "Marcus, look at the ledgers," Xavier pleaded, turning to another prominent board member, a strict financial veteran who had backed Xavier early on. "The equity is still there. The real estate market in Atlanta is booming. We can cover the 12 million. We just need to delay the initial public offering by 30 days. We restructure the debt, we move the assets from Gia's holding company back to the primary accounts, and we proceed as planned. Nobody outside this room needs to know." Marcus slowly closed his folder, taking off his reading glasses. He looked at Xavier with a mixture of profound disappointment and absolute disgust. "Xavier, you are completely delusional," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet. "You have not just breached a contract, you have committed federal crimes. You forged signatures, you manipulated financial statements, and you lied to the board of directors. The morality clause was triggered the second you moved corporate funds into a personal offshore account. You are no longer the chief executive officer of this company. The board is stripping you of your title, your voting rights, and your equity effective immediately." "You cannot do that," Xavier yelled, his voice cracking wildly. "I built this company. I am the face of this brand. Without me, there is no initial public offering. The media loves me. The culture loves me. The media loves a winner, Xavier," I interjected smoothly, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "And as of this morning, you are a catastrophic liability. You spent 10 years taking credit for the financial models I created. You convinced yourself that because you gave the speeches, you were the genius behind the operation. But a puppet is just a piece of wood without the person pulling the strings. I built the infrastructure of this empire, and I am the only one who knows how to keep it from collapsing entirely." Xavier glared at me, his chest heaving. He realized he was losing the board completely. He turned frantically to Gia, his last remaining lifeline. Gia opened the briefcase, he commanded, his voice sharp and desperate. "Give them the trust documents. Show them the account balances. Show them that we hold the majority shares." Gia fumbled with the locks on her leather briefcase, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open it. She pulled out a stack of heavily embossed legal papers, her eyes wide with panic. "I have them," she stammered, her voice tiny and terrified in the massive room. "The papers for the foundation. The $10 million. Xavier snatched the papers from her hands and slapped them down on the table in front of Richard. "There," Xavier breathed heavily, pointing at the documents. 51% of the liquid assets, safe and sound. Naya has no authority here." I looked at the documents on the table, then at Xavier, and finally at Gia. The absolute silence in the boardroom was heavy, expectant. The board members looked at the papers, then back to me, waiting to see how I would respond to this supposed trump card. She had just horrifyingly realized that the massive $10 million charity foundation she had so arrogantly bragged about at the Sunday cookout was actually a massive criminal liability holding stolen corporate funds. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my coffee cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, savored the rich, dark taste, and prepared to deliver the final, absolute killing blow. I set the porcelain cup back onto its saucer. The faint clink of the ceramic echoed through the silent boardroom. I reached across the table and picked up the stack of embossed legal papers Xavier had just triumphantly slammed down. I did not even bother opening the folder. I just held it in my hands, feeling the weight of the document that was about to send my husband to a federal penitentiary. "You see, gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with calm authority, "this is exactly why a man who relies on charisma should never try to play a game of chess against the woman who controls the board. Xavier truly believes that these documents represent his salvation. He thinks that by transferring the embezzled corporate capital into a supposedly independent charity foundation and an offshore holding trust, he has effectively shielded the money from both my legal reach and your corporate oversight." I tossed the folder back onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Richard. "Open it, Richard," I instructed. "Look at the signatory page. Tell the board whose name is listed as the primary beneficiary, the sole managing director, and the exclusive legal owner of those holding accounts." Richard opened the folder. He flipped past the dense legal jargon directly to the final page. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he read the names. "It is not Xavier," he announced, his voice thick with confusion and rising anger. "The only name on these documents is Gia Reynolds. She is listed as the sole proprietor of the foundation and the exclusive director of the offshore trust." "Exactly," I said, leaning back in my chair. I turned my gaze away from the board and focused entirely on Gia. She was still sitting next to Xavier, clutching her empty leather briefcase. She looked incredibly confused. She thought Richard announcing her name was a victory. She thought it proved that she was rich and powerful, that Xavier had elevated her to the status of a billionaire. She had absolutely no idea that she was wearing a financial suicide vest and Xavier was holding the detonator. "Gia," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, adopting the tone of a teacher explaining a harsh reality to a slow student. "Tell me about your business experience. Before you met my husband, what was your primary source of income?" Gia blinked, looking around the room defensively. She puffed out her chest, trying to look intimidating. "I am a brand ambassador," she stated proudly. "I have over 200,000 followers. I do sponsored content for luxury lifestyle brands." I nodded slowly. "Sponsored content. That is wonderful. So you have a deep, sophisticated understanding of international tax law, corporate compliance, and federal securities regulations." She frowned, crossing her arms. "Xavier handles the business side of the foundation. He said I just need to be the face of the charity. He said because we are in love, we share everything. He put the money in my name because he trusts me more than he trusts you." A few of the board members actually let out harsh, bitter laughs. Xavier closed his eyes, rubbing his temples desperately, trying to figure out a way to stop me from speaking. "He did not put the money in your name out of trust, Gia." I explained, my words falling like heavy stones in the quiet room. "He put the money in your name because he needed a human shield. Let me take you back to the charity gala 3 nights ago. Do you remember when I sat down at the table? Do you remember how Xavier reacted?" Gia swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Her false confidence was beginning to fracture as she recalled the sheer terror on Xavier's face that night. "He dropped his glass," she whispered. "He looked like he was going to be sick." "And do you know why he panicked?" I asked, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. "It was not because I caught him cheating. Xavier does not care about fidelity. He panicked because I called you by your legal name and I mentioned the shell companies." In that single moment, Xavier realized that his brilliant master plan had a fatal flaw. He realized that the chief financial officer of his company, the woman who audits every single wire transfer, knew exactly what he was doing in the dark. I stood up from my chair and began to slowly pace the length of the boardroom. The eyes of every powerful man in the room followed my every move. "Gentlemen," I addressed the board. Xavier knew that the SEC was eventually going to audit our pre-initial public offering financials. He knew that the $12 million he embezzled would be discovered, so he created a scapegoat. He approached a naive young influencer who loved designer clothes and expensive dinners. He convinced her that he was setting up a charity to help underprivileged youth. He showered her with gifts, he bought her a penthouse, and he handed her a stack of dense legal documents and told her to sign on the dotted line. I stopped pacing and stood directly behind Gia. She was trembling now. When you signed those papers, Gia, you did not become a billionaire, I told her coldly. You became the sole legal owner of 3 fraudulent shell companies and an illegal offshore trust. Xavier used your social security number, your digital signature, and your identity to wash stolen corporate capital. He deliberately structured the accounts so that his name appeared absolutely nowhere on the federal filings. Gia's breath hitched. She looked at Xavier, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. Xavier, what is she talking about? Gia demanded, her voice shrill. Tell them she is lying. Xavier could not look at her. He stared straight ahead at the mahogany table. His jaw clenched, his face covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Shut up, Gia, he hissed under his breath. Just shut up and let my lawyers handle this. There are no lawyers coming to save you, Xavier, I said, stepping back and returning to my seat at the head of the table. If the Securities and Exchange Commission raided this building today, they would not arrest Xavier. They would look at the documents Richard is holding, and they would arrest Gia Reynolds. They would charge her with federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. She would be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, while Xavier played the role of the innocent, betrayed chief executive officer who was tricked by a manipulative young mistress. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Richard slammed his hands on the table, cursing violently. Marcus was furiously typing on his phone, likely demanding his legal team freeze all associated assets immediately. The other board members were shouting over each other, demanding federal investigators be called right this second. But the loudest sound in the room was Gia. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She was hyperventilating, clutching her chest, as the glamorous billionaire lifestyle she thought she had secured shattered into a million sharp pieces. She looked at the man who had promised her the world, the man who had bought her a $2 million diamond necklace and moved her into a penthouse. You were going to let me go to prison, Gia screamed, her voice tearing through the chaos of the boardroom. You set me up. You used me. Xavier jumped up from his chair, grabbing her arm, trying to force her back into her seat. Keep your voice down, he ordered, his tone vicious and commanding, entirely stripped of his usual charm. You are making a scene. We will fix this. Do not touch me, Gia shrieked, yanking her arm away with such force that she nearly lost her balance. She was no longer the sweet, innocent, high society darling she had pretended to be at the Sunday cookout. The survival instincts of a woman who realized she was about to take the fall for a massive federal crime kicked in. But your masterstroke had one fatal flaw, Xavier. I continued, raising my voice just enough to cut through their screaming match. You assumed that because the shell companies were registered offshore, they were completely insulated from corporate debt. You assumed the money was safe. But you forgot that a shell company is still a functional corporate entity and it can still incur debt. I opened my red folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for the board to see. 6 months ago, when I first noticed the discrepancies in the ledgers, I did not confront you. I explained, looking directly at Xavier's pale, terrified face. I did not file for divorce, I simply investigated. When I traced the stolen funds to Gia's newly formed vendor companies, I made a quiet, strategic move. Using my family's trust fund, I aggressively purchased the secondary commercial debt of every single shell company registered in Gia's name. I bought the paper, all of it. Xavier stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. He realized exactly what that meant. I am not just the angry wife, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am the primary secured creditor of Gia's entire fraudulent operation. The debt I recalled yesterday morning did not just freeze your corporate accounts, Xavier. It instantly liquidated the offshore trusts. The $12 million you stole is currently sitting in a secure holding account managed by my lawyers. The money is locked. You have nothing. Gia turned to Xavier, her face twisted in pure hatred. She raised her hand and slapped him directly across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the boardroom. The board members actually went dead silent, watching the immaculate tech billionaire get physically assaulted by his own mistress. You pathetic coward, Gia screamed, spit flying from her lips. You ruined my life. You told me you loved me. You told me you were going to leave her and make me a queen. You were just trying to find a dummy to go to jail for you. Xavier touched his red cheek, his eyes blazing with fury. He raised his hand as if he were going to strike her back, but Richard stepped forward, grabbing Xavier by the shoulder and violently shoving him back against the wall. "Do not even think about it, you piece of garbage," Richard snarled. Gia looked at me, tears streaming down her face, ruining her heavy makeup. She was trembling visibly, realizing that I held her entire future in the palm of my hand. She was legally responsible for millions of dollars of stolen money. She was entirely at my mercy. "Please," Gia begged, her voice breaking as she looked at me across the massive wooden table. "Please, Mrs. Brooks. I did not know. I swear to you I did not know what those papers meant. He told me it was just a charity. He told me I was doing something good for the community. I will give you everything back. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just please do not let them send me to prison. I will testify against him. I will tell the feds everything he told me to do. I will give them the emails, the text messages, the voice notes. I have it all saved on my phone." Xavier lunged forward, desperately trying to grab Gia's purse where she kept her phone, but two of the board members immediately tackled him, dragging him back. "Shut up!" Xavier roared, struggling against the executives holding him down. "You are destroying everything." "He already destroyed it," Gia screamed back at him. "You destroyed it the second you put my name on those papers. I'm going to tell them everything, Xavier. I'm going to make sure you rot in a cell." I sat back in my leather chair watching the absolute destruction of my husband. He had walked into this room believing he was a king about to be crowned. Now he was being pinned against a wall by his own investors, while his mistress publicly volunteered to be the star witness for the federal prosecution. The panic I had seen in his eyes at the charity gala was entirely justified. He had tried to play a game of corporate espionage, but he had forgotten that I was the one who wrote the rulebook. The heavy mahogany doors to the boardroom suddenly burst open, hitting the glass walls with a violent crash. Tasha and DeAndre stormed into the room, completely ignoring the chaotic scene unfolding between the board members and Xavier. Tasha was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a frantic expression, holding a crumpled eviction notice tightly in her manicured fist. DeAndre looked completely unhinged, sweating profusely through his custom silk shirt. They had driven straight to the corporate headquarters expecting Xavier to magically fix the financial nightmare I had unleashed upon them earlier that morning. Instead, they walked right into the climax of his absolute destruction. Xavier used the sudden distraction to violently shove Richard away. He straightened his ruined suit jacket, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He looked at Tasha and DeAndre, then at the angry board members, and finally at Gia, who was still sobbing uncontrollably by the table. The realization that he had lost his company, his money, and his reputation finally shattered whatever was left of his sanity. He could not win on the corporate battlefield, so he retreated to the only arena where he thought he still held absolute power, the personal one. "You think you won?" Nia Xavier yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think taking the money means you broke me. You did not break anything. You just proved exactly what I'm going to tell the judge in family court. You are a vindictive, financially abusive woman who is mentally unfit to raise a child." He walked over to Gia and grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly to his side. He pointed at her slightly rounded stomach, his eyes wild with a manic, toxic pride. "Look at her, Nia. She is carrying my heir. She is giving me the one thing you never could. A real family. A continuation of my bloodline. You can take the company and you can take the offshore accounts, but I am going to take Leo. My lawyers are going to bury you. I will use every single connection I have left in this city to prove you are unstable. You will never see our son again, and I will build a new empire with the woman who actually gave me a child." Tasha nodded vigorously, stepping forward to support her brother despite the fact that he was currently being investigated for federal wire fraud. "That is right," Tasha shouted, pointing her crumpled eviction notice at me. "You cannot take his legacy, Naya. He is going to be a father. He is building a real family now." I sat perfectly still, watching Xavier parade his ultimate delusion in front of 12 wealthy investors, his sister and his brother-in-law. He was using a child he believed was his own as a weapon to inflict maximum emotional damage. He was trying to assert his dominance, his manhood, and his superiority. It was the most pathetic display of arrogance I had ever witnessed. I reached down into my leather briefcase one final time. I did not pull out a red financial ledger or a legal binder. I pulled out a stark white medical folder sealed with a red confidential stamp. I placed it gently on the polished wood of the conference table and pressed my hand flat against it. A real family! I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that commanded absolute silence in the chaotic room. An heir to your bloodline. I slid the white medical folder across the smooth surface of the table. It glided perfectly, stopping right at the edge of the wood directly in front of Xavier. Open it, Xavier, I commanded. Xavier stared at the white folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He did not move. He was breathing heavily, his manic confidence suddenly faltering. He recognized the distinct blue logo of the private medical facility printed in the upper corner of the folder. Open it! Richard barked, stepping forward and ripping the folder open himself when Xavier refused to move. Richard scanned the first page, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He looked up from the paper, staring at Xavier with an expression of pure disbelief. What is it? Marcus demanded, stepping closer to read over Richard's shoulder. I kept my eyes locked directly on Xavier, watching the last remaining shred of his pride evaporate into thin air. 8 years ago, I said, my voice clear and unwavering, before the tech empire, before the billions, before any of these investors even knew your name, you had a severe medical emergency. Do you remember, Xavier? Do you remember the weeks you spent in that private clinic, terrified that you were going to lose your life to an aggressive cellular disease? Xavier's face drained of all color. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He let go of Gia's arm, stepping away from her as if he had just been burned. Tasha frowned, looking back and forth between her brother and me. What is she talking about, Xavier? She demanded. What medical emergency? He never told you, Tasha, because his fragile masculine ego could not handle the truth, I explained smoothly. The doctors saved his life, but the treatment required an aggressive surgical intervention. To eradicate the disease, Xavier had to undergo a complete and irreversible removal of his reproductive capabilities. He is entirely sterile. He has a 0% chance of ever fathering a biological child. The boardroom descended into a silence so profound you could hear the heavy air conditioning humming through the ceiling vents. The corporate executives stared at Xavier, processing the magnitude of the lie. Xavier stood frozen, his dark skin pale and ashen, completely stripped of his dignity. For a man who built his entire persona on projecting alpha male dominance, having his deepest, most emasculating secret exposed in front of the most powerful men in Atlanta was a fate worse than federal prison. He lied to me, Gia whispered, her voice trembling, as she looked at the medical documents resting on the mahogany table. No, Gia, I corrected softly, turning my full attention to the 25-year-old mistress who thought she had secured a billionaire lifestyle through a calculated pregnancy. He did not lie to you about the baby. He desperately wanted to believe this child was a medical miracle. He wanted to believe his manhood was miraculously restored. You are the one who lied to him. I stood up from my executive chair, slowly smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I walked around the edge of the large table, stopping just a few feet away from where Gia was standing. She was shaking violently, her hands gripping the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing to the floor. So, Gia, I said, tilting my head slightly, we have definitively established that the baby you are carrying is absolutely not an heir to the Brooks family bloodline. We have established through certified medical records that Xavier is physically incapable of being the father. Which leads us to the ultimate question. I paused, letting the thick tension in the room stretch until it was nearly unbearable. Whose baby is it? I asked. Gia burst into hysterical tears. She covered her face with her trembling hands, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She shook her head desperately, refusing to answer. But she did not need to speak a single word. Her body language betrayed her entirely. Through her panicked tears, she slowly turned her head away from Xavier. She looked past the angry board members, past the white medical folder, and locked her terrified, bloodshot eyes directly on one specific person in the room, DeAndre. Every single head in the boardroom turned to follow her gaze. DeAndre was standing near the heavy doorway, completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk he usually wore was entirely gone, replaced by a look of absolute sheer terror. He was staring back at Gia, his eyes wide as saucers, silently begging her to look away from him. "You have got to be kidding me," Richard muttered, taking a massive step back in pure, utter disgust. The pieces fell into place with devastating precision. While Tasha was busy spending my generational wealth and playing the role of the elite society wife, her unemployed husband was secretly sleeping with her brother's mistress. DeAndre, the man who loved to preach about family values and loyalty, had been financing his secret affair using the very same corporate accounts Xavier was using to hide the stolen money. It was a tangled, pathetic web of extreme betrayal, and all of them were caught right in the middle of it. Tasha stood frozen, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose. She looked at Gia, then at DeAndre. Her mind struggled to process the horrific reality unfolding in front of her. The golden child of the family, the woman who thought she was better than everyone else, suddenly realized her entire life was a humiliating joke. DeAndre, Tasha whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not sleep with my brother's mistress." DeAndre raised his hands, taking a slow, cautious step backward toward the hallway. "Tasha, baby, please," he stammered, sweat pouring down his face. "It was a massive mistake. It meant nothing. She came on to me. I swear to you, it meant absolutely nothing to me." The verbal confirmation hit Tasha like a physical blow to the chest. The perfect family facade she had so desperately tried to maintain shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound of pure primal agony and rage that echoed through the entire executive suite and out into the bullpen. She lunged forward, flying across the room, and tackled DeAndre directly to the hardwood floor. "You disgusting piece of trash!" Tasha shrieked wildly, swinging her fists at his face, scratching and clawing at him as they rolled across the floor. "I gave you everything. You slept with this cheap little girl. I am going to kill you right here." DeAndre threw his arms up, trying to shield his face from his wife's frantic assault, yelling for corporate security to come help him. Gia backed away, screaming in terror as the violence erupted, pressing herself flat against the glass wall. Xavier remained completely motionless, staring blankly at the white medical folder on the table, watching his sister viciously beat her husband, while his pregnant mistress cowered in the corner. His empire was completely gone. His money was completely gone. His freedom was completely gone. And now his family was destroying itself right in front of him. I stood quietly at the head of the boardroom, watching the spectacular implosion of the Brooks family. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched them tear each other apart with the very same toxic secrets they had used to try and destroy me. My victory was absolute. The physical altercation on the floor of the executive boardroom was the grotesque grand finale to their fraudulent lives. Corporate security guards finally rushed through the shattered mahogany doors, grabbing Tasha by the arms and pulling her off DeAndre. She kicked and screamed, her designer dress torn at the seam, her expensive sunglasses crushed underfoot. DeAndre scrambled backward, pressing himself against the glass wall, his face scratched and bleeding, his silk shirt completely ruined. The elite investors, the men of high society who had previously treated the Brooks family like royalty, now stared at them with unfiltered disgust. Richard took out a silk handkerchief and wiped his hands as if the very air around them was contaminated. Before Tasha could break free from the guards, the heavy atmosphere in the room shifted once again. The chaotic yelling was abruptly cut short by the sharp, authoritative sound of heavy boots marching in unison down the executive hallway. The crowd of panicked employees who had gathered outside the glass walls parted instantly. Through the doorway stepped 6 men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI and SEC emblazoned across the back. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely stoic expression, walked directly into the center of the boardroom. He bypassed the struggling Tasha, he bypassed the bleeding DeAndre, and he bypassed the terrified Gia. He walked straight toward Xavier, who was still standing completely paralyzed by the conference table. "Xavier Brooks," the agent stated, his voice projecting over the heavy breathing of the security guards. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Xavier stumbled backward, his hands instinctively rising in the air. "Wait!" he pleaded, his voice cracking wildly. "There is a massive misunderstanding here. I am the chief executive officer of this company. We are taking this firm public tomorrow. You cannot just march in here and arrest me without evidence. My lawyers will have your badges for this." The lead agent did not even blink. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "We have more than enough evidence, Mr. Brooks," the agent replied coldly, stepping forward and grabbing Xavier by the wrist. "We have a fully documented trail of $12 million in illicit wire transfers routed through offshore shell companies. And we have a crystal clear audio recording of you explicitly admitting to hiding those stolen funds in a trust to avoid legal scrutiny." Xavier's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The audio recording. He remembered the night in our living room when he arrogantly threw the post-nuptial agreement on the coffee table. He remembered boasting about the Cayman Islands Trust, thinking he had completely outsmarted me. He had handed me the murder weapon, and I had delivered it straight to the federal government. "You did this!" Xavier hissed, his face contorting in pure hatred as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around his wrists. "You recorded me in my own home. You set me up." "I did not set you up, Xavier," I replied calmly, my voice echoing through the silent room. "You built the trap, you loaded the spring, and you stepped right into it. I simply handed the authorities the map." As the agents began to read him the rest of his Miranda rights, a shrill, devastated cry echoed from the hallway. Vivian pushed her way through the crowd of stunned employees. She had rushed to the corporate headquarters after the eviction notice was served, hoping Xavier would somehow fix her shattered reality. Instead, she walked right into the epicenter of her family's total annihilation. Vivian froze in the doorway, her eyes taking in the horrific scene. She saw Tasha, her golden child, the woman who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of high society elegance, being restrained by security guards looking like a street brawler. She saw DeAndre bleeding and cowering in the corner, exposed as an unfaithful parasite. She saw Gia, the supposedly perfect mistress, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her pregnant stomach, realizing the father of her child was broke and the man she was with was going to federal prison. And then Vivian saw Xavier, her brilliant, successful billionaire son, the man she had worshipped, the man she had used to elevate her own social status, to look down on me and my education. He was standing in the center of the boardroom, handcuffed, humiliated, surrounded by the elite investors she so desperately wanted to impress. Richard Marcus and the other venture capitalists looked at Vivian with pity and contempt. The illusion of the Brooks family legacy was dead, and the elite society she worshipped was watching the corpse burn. Vivian clutched her chest, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, and her knees simply gave out. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, weeping hysterically, burying her face in her hands as the sheer magnitude of her shame crushed the breath out of her lungs. Tasha screamed for her mother, but the security guards refused to let her go. Xavier struggled against the federal agents as they turned him toward the door. The reality of his future finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. He was going to lose his freedom. He was going to a federal penitentiary. He stopped fighting the agents and turned his desperate, terrified eyes back to me. "Nia, please!" Xavier begged, his voice breaking, cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "Please, you have to help me. You know the best defense attorneys in the city. You have the money. You can post my bail. You can fix this. You always fix things for me." I stood at the head of the mahogany table watching him grovel. I did not move a single inch. "We are family," Nia Xavier pleaded, tears streaming down his face, ignoring the disgusted stares of his investors. We are a black family. We are supposed to stick together against the system. You cannot just hand me over to them. They will destroy me. You have to protect us. We are supposed to protect each other. He was trying to use the very culture he had exploited as a shield. He was trying to invoke a sense of racial loyalty and familial duty, the exact same duty he had weaponized to force me into submission for 10 years. He thought he could pull the ultimate manipulation card, begging for my solidarity as a black woman, while completely ignoring the fact that he had spent a decade tearing me down. I walked slowly around the edge of the conference table. The federal agents paused for a moment, allowing me to stand face to face with the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I looked at his tear-stained face, his ruined tuxedo, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. I looked at Tasha sobbing on the floor and Vivian curled up in a ball of shame. I am protecting my family, Xavier. I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any sorrow. I let the words hang in the air, ensuring that every single person in the room heard my absolute final judgment. You are just a bad investment, I concluded. I turned my back on him and walked back toward the glass windows overlooking the city. I did not watch as the federal agents pushed him forward. I did not flinch when he started screaming my name, begging and pleading as they dragged him out of the boardroom and down the executive hallway. I did not react as Tasha was finally released by security, rushing over to her mother, crying hysterically amidst the ruins of their fraudulent lives. I did not even look at Gia as she quietly slipped out of the room, terrified that the authorities would be coming for her next. The boardroom slowly emptied out. The investors filed out silently, shaking their heads, grateful to have narrowly escaped the blast radius of Xavier's ego. The security guards escorted the crying remnants of the Brooks family out of the building. Within 10 minutes, the massive executive suite was completely silent again. I stood alone looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The sun was fully up now, reflecting brightly off the glass and steel towers of the city. For 10 years, I had lived in the shadow of a man who demanded all the credit while forcing me to carry all the weight. I had dimmed my own light to ensure his ego remained intact. I had allowed his family to disrespect me, to belittle my accomplishments, and to treat my generational wealth as their personal piggy bank. But today the shadows were gone. I picked up my briefcase, the one containing the legitimate ledgers, the trust documents, and the undeniable proof of my absolute ownership of the corporate assets. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the shattered mahogany doors wide open. The employees in the bullpen stood up as I walked past them, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. They knew exactly who had just taken down the chief executive officer. They knew exactly who held the keys to the kingdom. I stepped into the private elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent was smooth, fast, and incredibly quiet. When the doors opened, I walked out of the building and into the bright, warm air of the city. My car was waiting at the curb. I tipped the valet, slipped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The legal annihilation of Xavier Brooks was complete. His empire was dismantled, his wealth was reclaimed, and his toxic family was banished back to the reality they had tried so desperately to escape. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the morning traffic, leaving the corporate headquarters behind me. I had a lot of work to do to rebuild the company, but for the first time in a decade, I was driving entirely on my own terms. 6 months have passed since that morning in the boardroom. The fallout from Xavier's arrogance was swift, brutal, and entirely public. When you build an empire on a foundation of lies and stolen money, the collapse does not just break the foundation. It shatters the entire neighborhood. Xavier is currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting sentencing. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of corporate embezzlement, desperately trying to secure a plea deal. The judge was not impressed by his former billionaire status. He is facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His picture was splashed across the front page of every major financial publication, not as the visionary genius he desperately wanted to be, but as a cautionary tale of greed and toxic ego. The media loves a winner, but they love a spectacular downfall even more. Tasha and DeAndre's marriage did not survive the revelation in the boardroom. Within a week, Tasha filed for divorce, furious about the betrayal with Gia. But there were no assets left to divide. With their house foreclosed on their luxury cars repossessed, and DeAndre's fraudulent logistics company padlocked, their divorce proceedings look more like a bankruptcy hearing. Tasha moved into a cheap apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She recently applied for a job as an entry-level receptionist at a local real estate office. They did not hire her. Vivian experienced the most devastating social fall of all. The high society women she used to play tennis with, the same women she bragged to about her son's empire, completely shunned her. In elite circles, financial scandal is a highly contagious disease, and no one wanted to catch it. She was forced to move into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. She spends her days watching daytime television, completely isolated, a prisoner of her own manufactured shame. As for Gia, the federal government did not send her to prison, recognizing she was heavily manipulated. However, ignorance is not a defense against the IRS. Because her name was on the fraudulent foundation documents, she was hit with massive tax penalties for the $12 million Xavier tried to wash. She was forced to sell the diamond necklace, the designer bags, and anything else of value just to pay the legal fees to keep herself out of a jail cell. She is currently working at a mid-level retail store in Macon, Georgia, trying to figure out how to pay off a tax debt she will likely carry for the rest of her life. And me. I am sitting in the corner office of the newly restructured, highly profitable Apex Holding Group. The board of directors did not hesitate to appoint me as the undisputed chief executive officer. I spent the last 6 months aggressively cleaning house, renegotiating the debt, and successfully launching a much smaller but entirely legitimate initial public offering. The company is thriving, built on actual equity, not leveraged lies. I redesigned the office. I threw out the heavy mahogany desk Xavier loved so much and replaced it with a sleek modern glass one. But my greatest victory is not in the boardroom. It is Friday evening. The sun is setting over Atlanta, painting the sky in vibrant shades of purple and gold. I am sitting in the backyard of my new home, a beautiful sprawling estate that I purchased entirely in my own name. The air is filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. My son Leo is running across the grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy I bought him for his birthday. He is happy, healthy, and entirely shielded from the toxicity of the Brooks family. Around the patio table sit the people who truly matter. Valerie Sterling, my brilliant attorney who fought like a gladiator for me. Julian, my wealth manager from Geneva, who flew in just for the weekend. And my 3 best friends from my Spelman College days, women who held my hand through the darkest nights and celebrated with me when the sun finally came up. This is my chosen family. A circle of people who respect my boundaries, celebrate my success, and love me for exactly who I am, not for what my bank account can provide them. I raise my glass of sparkling water, watching Leo laugh as the puppy tackles him into the soft grass. I feel a profound, unshakable peace. To every woman watching this right now, especially to the Black women who are so often expected to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. We are taught from a very young age to be the strong one. We are taught to be the backbone, the silent supporter, the one who sacrifices her own peace to build up the men and the families around us. We are told that our value is tied to our loyalty, even when that loyalty is completely one-sided. Do not ever dim your light to stroke a man's ego. Do not ever shrink yourself so that someone else can feel big. If you are the one building the foundation, if you are the one balancing the books and doing the heavy lifting, you deserve to have your name on the deed. Do not let anyone manipulate you into believing that asking for respect, demanding transparency, or setting firm boundaries makes you bitter or difficult. It makes you a CEO of your own life. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it does not require you to keep toxic people in your inner circle. You have the absolute right to restructure your investments, whether those investments are financial, emotional, or spiritual. You are allowed to walk away from tables where you are no longer valued. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic dynamic and rebuild your life on your own terms? Have you ever had to become the villain in someone else's story to become the hero in your own? I would love to read your experiences in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, if you believe in the power of boundaries and the beauty of a chosen family, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with a woman in your life who might need a reminder of her own incredible strength. Thank you for being here, and thank you for letting me share my truth. Keep building your empires, and never apologize for wearing the crown you paid for.